The wind howled through the small seaside town of Clearhaven, its frosted breath swirling around the lampposts that flickered dimly against the encroaching dusk. Christmas Eve was always quiet here, with most residents tucked into their homes, preparing for family dinners and midnight masses. Yet, in the heart of Main Street stood a modest café, its windows glowing warmly against the chill. The hand-painted sign above the door read Martha's Hearth, a name that encapsulated everything the place had come to symbolize. Martha Greer, the café's owner, was a woman of gentle determination. At 55, her graying hair was always tied back in a neat bun, and her blue eyes sparkled with a kindness that seemed untouched by life's hardships. Martha had lived in Clearhaven all her life, inheriting the café from her parents and pouring her soul into it ever since. The café wasn't a fancy establishment. The wooden tables bore the marks of countless cups of coffee and the scrawls of restless children, but it was loved. To the town, Martha's Hearth was more than a place to eat. It was a haven for connection, warmth, and a sense of belonging. That particular Christmas season, however, had been rough for Martha. Business had slowed to a crawl as inflation tightened wallets and tourists opted for trendier spots in nearby cities. She'd scraped together enough to keep the lights on, but the stack of bills on her counter felt heavier than ever. Still, her struggles hadn't dimmed her spirit. The thought of anyone in Clearhaven spending Christmas without a meal haunted her, so she posted a simple sign on the café's window. Free Christmas dinner, no questions asked. All are welcome. 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. The sign wasn't for show. Martha meant it. For weeks, she'd been preparing, using her savings to buy fresh ingredients for hearty stews, buttery rolls, and pies spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg. She didn't care if it strained her already tight budget. To her, kindness wasn't about convenience, it was about doing what was right. As Christmas Eve descended, the café's tables began to fill. Families who had fallen on hard times, elderly neighbors who couldn't bear the solitude of an empty house, and even the odd passerby wandering into town were drawn in by the promise of a warm meal. The air was filled with laughter, the clink of cutlery, and the aroma of freshly baked bread. It was during the rush of serving steaming bowls of stew that Martha noticed him, a scruffy man sitting alone at the farthest table. His clothes were worn, his hands calloused, and his face lined with a kind of weariness that told 1,000 untold stories. He kept his gaze fixed on the table, avoiding eye contact, and ate silently. Martha had seen people like him before. Clearhaven, like any town, had its share of wanderers, people who came and went, leaving only faint traces of their presence. She walked over with a smile and placed a slice of apple pie in front of him. "Merry Christmas," she said softly. He looked up, startled, his deep brown eyes filled with a mix of suspicion and gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice hoarse. She didn't press him for conversation, respecting the unspoken boundaries he seemed to carry. Instead, she returned to the kitchen, where her small staff, 3 part-time workers who had volunteered to help, were busy preparing the next round of meals. As the evening wore on, the café's atmosphere grew almost magical. Strangers shared stories over cups of hot cocoa, children played with makeshift toys under the tables, and a group of teenagers even started singing carols by the counter. Martha's heart swelled with joy. For a few hours, it felt as if the world's worries had melted away. When the clock struck 8, the last of the diners trickled out, leaving behind a scattering of empty plates and full hearts. Martha and her staff began the arduous task of cleaning up, their exhaustion mingling with satisfaction. She noticed the scruffy man lingering near the door, as if hesitant to leave. "Can I help you with something?" she asked gently. He hesitated before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. "I wanted to thank you," he said. This means more than you know." She unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words written in shaky handwriting. It was a note of gratitude, but something else caught her attention, a small sketch of the café, drawn with surprising precision. "Did you draw this?" she asked, astonished. He nodded, his cheeks flushing. "I used to be an artist, before things got tough." Martha's mind whirled. The sketch captured her café in a way she had never seen before, every detail rendered with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "This is beautiful," she said. "Thank you." That night, as she locked up the café, Martha couldn't stop thinking about the man in his drawing. She decided to frame it, hanging it near the counter where it caught the light of the morning sun. It became a conversation piece for her customers, many of whom were moved by the story behind it. What Martha didn't realize was that the drawing would soon set off a chain of events she could never have anticipated. In the days that followed Christmas, the framed drawing became a quiet beacon at Martha's hearth. Customers admired it as they ordered their morning coffee or lingered over bowls of soup. The sketch, delicate yet vibrant, seemed to capture the soul of the café, its warmth practically glowing from the page. It wasn't long before people began asking questions. "Who made this one?" Regular inquired, running her fingers lightly over the frame. Martha smiled as she poured coffee into a ceramic mug. "A man who visited on Christmas Eve. He didn't give his name, but he left this as a thank you." The story sparked curiosity, especially among the townsfolk who had been at the café that night. Whispers began circulating about the mysterious artist. Some speculated that he might be a once-famous painter fallen on hard times, while others thought he was just another drifter passing through Clearhaven. Martha, however, preferred not to speculate. To her, the drawing was a gift, and she was content to leave it at that. One rainy afternoon, about a week into the new year, the café door jingled, and a young woman stepped inside. Her umbrella dripped water onto the floor as she scanned the room, her eyes landing on the framed sketch near the counter. She approached Martha hesitantly. "Excuse me," the woman said, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. "I hope this isn't too forward, but did someone named James leave that drawing here?" The name struck Martha like a bell, reverberating through her memory of the quiet man from Christmas Eve. "I'm not sure," she replied carefully. "A man left it as a thank you, but he didn't give his name." "Why do you ask?" The woman sighed, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over her expression. "That sounds like him. James is my brother. We lost track of him a few years ago, but I've been looking for him ever since." Martha's heart tightened. She gestured to a nearby table, motioning for the young woman to sit. "Why don't you tell me more about him?" Her name was Clara, and she explained that James had once been a promising artist, known for his ability to bring life to even the simplest scenes. "He had a gallery in the city," Clara said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. But then things started falling apart. He struggled with depression, lost his gallery, and eventually disappeared. "I've been following small leads, hoping to find him." Martha listened intently, her mind racing. The man she'd met had seemed burdened by more than just hunger, and Clara's story filled in the gaps. When Clara finished speaking, she reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph. "This is James. Is this the man who came here?" Martha took the picture and nodded slowly. The resemblance was unmistakable. "That's him," she confirmed. "He didn't say much, but he seemed grateful and kind." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe I was so close to finding him." "I'll keep an eye out for him," Martha promised. "If he comes back, I'll let him know you're looking for him." The young woman thanked her and left, her expression lighter than when she'd arrived. Martha, however, couldn't shake the thought of James. She began keeping a notebook near the register, jotting down anything she remembered about his visit, what he wore, how he spoke, even the way he'd lingered near the door. She hoped the details might one day help Clara reunite with her brother. As January stretched into February, the café saw its usual ebb and flow of business. Life in Clearhaven carried on, the slow rhythms of the small town unaffected by the wider world. But one chilly morning, something unusual happened. A man in a tailored suit walked into the café, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor. He wasn't the kind of customer Martha usually saw. With a quick glance around the room, his eyes locked onto the framed sketch. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, and he approached the counter. "Excuse me," he said, his voice crisp but not unfriendly. "Do you know who created that drawing?" Martha, caught off guard, hesitated. "A man who came by on Christmas Eve," she said. "Why do you ask?" The man reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. "My name is Richard Carlyle. I represent an art gallery in New York City. That sketch bears a striking resemblance to the work of James Grayson. He was once a client of ours." Martha felt a spark of hope. "James? You knew him?" "Not personally," Richard clarified, "but his work was extraordinary. We tried to support him during his difficult years, but he vanished. I've been hoping to reconnect with him. If he's still creating, he could have a remarkable comeback." Martha thought of Clara and her search for her brother. "I don't know where he is," she admitted, "but his sister came by recently, looking for him too. She's desperate to find him." Richard frowned thoughtfully. If he created that piece, he said, pointing to the drawing, then his talent hasn't faded. With the right opportunity, he could change his life. The man's words lingered with Martha long after he left. That evening, she decided to call Clara. I think I've found someone who can help James, she said, explaining the encounter with Richard Carlyle. Clara's voice trembled with gratitude. Thank you, Martha. I'll do whatever it takes to bring him home. From that moment, Martha felt like a piece of something larger, a thread connecting Clara, Richard, and James in ways none of them could have predicted. Yet, she knew this was only the beginning. Winter gradually gave way to the first tentative whispers of spring in Clearhaven. The snowbanks receded into muddy puddles, and the air carried the faint promise of renewal. At Martha's hearth, the café bustled with its usual rhythm, but Martha herself often found her mind drifting back to James. Weeks had passed since Clara's visit and the unexpected encounter with Richard Carlyle, and though she hadn't seen or heard from James, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the café's windows, Clara returned. This time, she wasn't alone. A wiry man stood beside her, his shoulders hunched as though he were trying to make himself smaller. He wore a threadbare jacket and kept his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, but there was no mistaking the familiar lines of his face. James, Martha whispered, her heart swelling. Clara stepped forward, her face glowing with relief. I found him, she said. It wasn't easy, but I did. He's been living in shelters up north. James glanced around the café, his gaze briefly lingering on the framed sketch before returning to Martha. I didn't think I'd see this place again, he said quietly. Thank you for what you did that night. You don't know how much it meant. Martha smiled warmly. You're always welcome here. Clara pulled out a chair for James, and the three of them sat at a corner table. Over cups of tea and plates of Martha's homemade shortbread, they pieced together what had happened in the months since Christmas Eve. Clara explained how she'd followed every lead, sometimes hitting dead ends, until a shelter worker recognized James from the description and put her in touch with him. James, in turn, spoke hesitantly about his struggles, the darkness that had swallowed his creative spark, the shame that kept him from reaching out to those who loved him, and the long, cold nights when he wondered if he'd ever find his way back. Martha listened intently, her heart aching for the quiet, soft-spoken man. You've got more people rooting for you than you realize, she said gently, and your talent hasn't gone unnoticed. At that, James looked up, his expression tinged with curiosity. What do you mean? Martha hesitated for a moment, then told him about Richard Carlyle's visit. He recognized your work, she said. He thinks you could make a comeback. James's brow furrowed. A comeback, he repeated, almost bitterly. I don't know if I have it in me anymore. I've been out of the game for too long. Clara reached for his hand. James, you've never stopped being an artist. That sketch you left here, it's proof that your gift hasn't gone anywhere. James didn't respond immediately, but the flicker of doubt in his eyes was slowly being replaced by something else, the faintest glimmer of hope. Over the next few days, Martha found herself watching a transformation take place. Clara convinced James to stay in Clearhaven for a while, and he began spending his mornings at the café, sketching quietly at one of the corner tables. His pencil moved with a purpose that hadn't been there before, and though he rarely shared his work, Martha could see the change in him. He seemed lighter, as if the act of creating was slowly chipping away at the weight he carried. Word of James's talent spread, thanks to the framed drawing and Martha's quiet encouragement to her customers. Soon, locals began asking him to sketch portraits or scenes of their favorite spots in town. Though James initially resisted, saying he wasn't ready, the requests became too heartfelt to refuse. One day, Mrs. Alden, an elderly woman who had been a regular at the café for decades, approached him. James, she said, my late husband and I used to sit by the harbor every Sunday morning. It was our special spot. Could you draw it for me? Her words seemed to strike a chord, and James nodded. I'll try, he said. The resulting sketch was breathtaking. James captured not just the physical details of the harbor, the weathered boats, the rippling water, but also the intangible essence of peace and memory that Mrs. Alden had described. When he presented it to her, she cried, clutching the drawing as though it were a priceless treasure. Martha watched the exchange from behind the counter, her chest swelling with pride. James was finding his way back, one sketch at a time. As James's confidence grew, so did his connection to the community. Locals began offering to pay for his sketches, insisting that his talent deserved recognition. Though he was reluctant to accept money at first, Martha gently urged him to see it as a step toward rebuilding his life. "You've earned this," she told him one evening as they closed up the cafe. "And people want to support you. Let them." James nodded, his gratitude shining through his uncertainty. "You've been so kind to me, Martha. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You already have," she said, glancing at the framed sketch on the wall. "You reminded me why this cafe matters." It wasn't long before Richard Carlisle returned to Clearhaven, this time with a portfolio of James's recent work in hand. "These are remarkable," he said, spreading the sketches out on a table. "James, your perspective, your attention to detail, it's all still there. If you're willing, I'd like to feature your work in a gallery show." James stared at him, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. "A gallery show?" "Yes," Richard said firmly. "We'll start small, maybe a local exhibit, and see where it goes. But I believe in you, and I think others will too." Clara beamed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "James, this is your chance." Martha, standing nearby, chimed in. "It's a new beginning." James looked at the faces around him, Clara's, filled with hope, Richard's, filled with professional confidence, and Martha's, filled with quiet encouragement. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could reclaim the life he thought he'd lost. He extended his hand to Richard. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady. That night, as Martha locked up the cafe, she couldn't help but smile. Something extraordinary was happening, and she was grateful to have played a small part in it. But even she couldn't have imagined just how far James's journey would take him, or how it would impact them all. The weeks leading up to James's gallery show were a whirlwind of activity. Richard Carlisle worked tirelessly to prepare the exhibit, curating a selection of James's sketches that spanned both his earlier works and the pieces he'd created since returning to Clearhaven. Clara handled the practicalities, from organizing travel plans for potential buyers to coordinating with local media outlets to ensure the event was well publicized. James, for his part, threw himself into his work with an intensity that surprised even himself. Each morning he arrived at Martha's hearth with a sketchbook under his arm and a steaming cup of Martha's coffee waiting for him. The cafe had become his sanctuary, a place where he could create without judgment and where every new piece felt like another step toward reclaiming his identity. Martha watched him with quiet pride. She'd seen the transformation in him, not just in his art, but in the way he carried himself. The man who had once hunched over his meal on Christmas Eve, barely meeting her gaze, now stood a little taller. He greeted customers with a shy but genuine smile, and his laughter, once rare, began to ripple through the cafe more often. The cafe itself became an unofficial hub for the gallery show preparations. Locals stopped by to offer encouragement, and some even brought James supplies: fresh pencils, high-quality paper, and a set of watercolors that made his eyes widen with childlike excitement. For the people of Clearhaven, James's success felt like their own. One rainy afternoon, just days before the show, James was hunched over his sketchbook at the corner table. He was working on a piece that Richard had requested, a larger, more polished rendering of Martha's hearth. The drawing was almost complete, and every line seemed to breathe with life: the glow of the cafe's windows, the scuff marks on the wooden tables, the way the light caught Martha's ever-present smile. "Looks like you're almost finished," Martha said, placing a fresh cup of tea beside him. James nodded, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. "This one's special," he admitted. "I want it to feel honest, like it shows what this place really means." Martha blinked back tears. "You've already done that, James. This cafe is lucky to have been part of your story." He hesitated, then said softly, "It's more than that, Martha. Without this place, without you, I don't think I'd have a story to tell." The night of the gallery show arrived, and the Clearhaven Community Center had never looked more elegant. String lights twinkled across the ceiling, and James's artwork was displayed on sleek easels and framed panels. The pieces ranged from intimate portraits of Clearhaven residents to sweeping landscapes of the harbor and nearby hills. At the center of the room, a special section was dedicated to his new works, including the drawing of Martha's hearth. The turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. Local townsfolk mingled with out-of-town art enthusiasts, gallery owners, and collectors, all drawn by the buzz Richard had generated. Clara stood by James's side, beaming with pride, while Richard introduced him to potential buyers. James felt a mixture of awe and disbelief as people admired his work, their compliments flowing like a warm tide. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, and more than once, he found himself retreating to the edges of the room for a moment of quiet. During one such moment, Martha approached him, a soft smile on her face. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "It's overwhelming," James admitted. "But in a good way. I never thought I'd see something like this." "You deserve every bit of it," Martha said firmly. "And don't forget, we're all rooting for you." James nodded, his gratitude too vast for words. Before he could respond, Richard appeared, his expression alight with excitement. "James," he said, "you need to hear this. One of the collectors here tonight has fallen in love with your work. He's offering to buy several pieces for his private collection. It's a significant deal." "How significant?" James asked, his voice shaky. "Significant enough to change your life," Richard said. "The offer is for $15,000. James stared at him, the number reverberating in his mind. He had spent years scraping by, wondering if he'd ever feel secure again, and now, in one evening, his art had earned him something he couldn't have imagined. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed. "Say yes," Clara urged, squeezing his arm. James turned to Richard, his heart pounding. "Yes," he said. "Absolutely yes." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, handshakes, and heartfelt toasts. By the end of the night, James felt as though he were walking on air. The collector's offer not only provided him with financial stability but also validated the years of struggle he had endured. More importantly, it gave him hope for the future, a future where he could continue creating, not as a man lost to his demons, but as an artist rediscovering his purpose. As the crowd began to thin, James sought out Martha. He found her standing by the drawing of her café, her expression soft with reflection. "Thank you," he said simply. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. "For what?" "For believing in me," he said. "For giving me a chance when I didn't believe in myself." Martha shook her head. "You've always had the talent, James. All I did was remind you of what you already knew deep down." He smiled, then glanced at the framed drawing. "I want you to have it," he said. "The original. It belongs here." Martha's hand flew to her mouth. "James, I can't. You can," he interrupted. "This place gave me my start. It's only right." Martha accepted the gift with tears in her eyes, knowing it was far more than a gesture. It was a symbol of hope, resilience, and the quiet power of kindness. As James looked around the gallery one last time, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. His journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was on solid ground. And he knew, deep in his heart, that he wasn't walking it alone. The weeks following the gallery show were a whirlwind of change for James. The collector's purchase allowed him to secure a modest apartment in Clearhaven, just a short walk from Martha's Hearth. It wasn't lavish by any means, but it was a quiet, sunlit space where he could work, rest, and finally begin rebuilding his life with dignity. For the first time in years, he could buy groceries without counting every penny and replace his worn shoes with a new pair that didn't pinch his toes. But more than the financial security, the gallery show had given James something far more valuable: a sense of belonging. The townsfolk now greeted him with warmth and familiarity, treating him as one of their own. Strangers stopped him on the street to compliment his work or ask for a portrait, while Martha's Café continued to be a sanctuary where he felt truly at home. One morning, James sat at his usual table, a blank canvas in front of him. The café bustled around him, the air filled with the sounds of clinking dishes and soft conversation. He had been working on a series of paintings for an upcoming show in a nearby city, but today he found himself staring at the empty canvas, unable to start. Martha noticed his hesitation and approached with a fresh cup of coffee. "Block?" she asked, gesturing to the canvas. James sighed. "Something like that. I keep thinking about what comes next, and it's overwhelming." Martha sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. "You've already come so far, James. One step at a time, remember? You don't have to have all the answers right now." He nodded, her words settling over him like a calming breeze. "You're right. I think I just need to remember why I started doing this in the first place. Maybe you've been thinking about what other people want to see, Martha suggested gently. But what do you want to create? James considered this, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I think I know. That evening, James began a new piece. This time, he wasn't focused on impressing gallery owners or collectors. Instead, he let his memories guide him, the vivid images of the places and people that had shaped him. His pencil moved swiftly, sketching the early outlines of a painting that felt deeply personal. Over the following days, the painting began to take form, a scene of Martha's hearth on Christmas Eve. The cafe's glowing windows spilled light onto the snowy street, while inside the tables were filled with the faces of those who had been there that night. At the center of it all was Martha, her warm smile radiating the kindness and strength that had sparked his journey back to himself. As he worked, James felt a profound sense of gratitude. This painting wasn't just an homage to the café, it was a testament to the small, quiet moments that had saved him when he was at his lowest. When the painting was finished, James invited Clara, Martha, and Richard to his apartment to see it. They gathered in his tiny living room, their anticipation palpable as James unveiled the canvas. For a moment, there was silence. Then Clara let out a soft gasp. James, she said, her voice trembling, it's beautiful. Martha's eyes filled with tears as she stepped closer to the painting. You captured it perfectly, she said. It's like looking into a memory. Richard nodded approvingly. This is your finest work yet, James. It's honest, raw, and deeply moving. This needs to be seen. James looked at them, his chest tight with emotion. I wanted to give something back, he said. This cafe, this town, you've all given me so much. I wouldn't be here without you. True to Richard's prediction, the painting became the centerpiece of James's next show. It drew not only local attention but also praise from critics, who were struck by its emotional depth and authenticity. The painting was purchased by a collector who offered a generous sum, but James made one condition: a high-quality replica of the painting would remain in Clearhaven, displayed in a public space for everyone to enjoy. The town held a small ceremony to unveil the replica, placing it in the foyer of the Clearhaven Community Center. Residents gathered to celebrate, their faces beaming with pride as they admired the painting. Martha stood beside James, her hand resting lightly on his arm. You've come a long way, she said. So have we, James replied, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. This isn't just my story, it's ours. By spring, James had fully embraced his new life. He spent his days creating art, mentoring local students who dreamed of becoming artists, and giving back to the community that had given him a second chance. Martha's hearth remained a constant in his life, its doors always open to him. One sunny afternoon, as he sipped coffee at his favorite table, a group of children approached him, their hands clutching sketchbooks and pencils. Can you show us how to draw like you? One of them asked, her eyes wide with excitement. James smiled, pulling his chair closer to make room for them. I'd love to, he said, his heart swelling with joy. As the children crowded around him, eagerly copying his strokes, Martha watched from the counter, a soft smile on her face. The cafe buzzed with life, and the air felt electric with possibility. Clearhaven had always been a small town, but on that day it felt like the center of something extraordinary, a place where kindness sparked miracles, and hope was never too far away. That evening, as the cafe hummed with life, Martha took a rare moment to pause. She stood near the counter, her hand resting on the framed sketch James had gifted her months ago, the one that started it all. Around her, the room was filled with familiar faces, families sharing meals, teenagers laughing over cups of cocoa, and Clara chatting animatedly with James's parents. James himself was seated at his usual table, a cluster of children gathered around him. They watched in awe as his pencil danced across the page, bringing a whimsical seascape to life. The once shy artist now radiated quiet confidence, his voice carrying easily over the soft murmur of the cafe. Martha smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She thought back to the cold Christmas Eve when all of this had begun, when a simple gesture of kindness had set off a chain of events that no one could have foreseen. She hadn't done it for recognition or reward, and yet, in giving to others, she had received so much in return. As the evening wound down, James approached her, his hands tucked into his pockets. Busy night, he said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Always is when you're here, Martha teased lightly. Then, more seriously, she added, you've become part of the heart of this place, James. I hope you know that. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. And you've been the heart of this town, Martha. You saw something in me when I couldn't see it myself. I'll never forget that. Before she could respond, Clara appeared, carrying a small, wrapped package. This is for you, Martha, she said, handing it over with a shy smile. It's from all of us. Martha unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a beautifully bound book. Inside were pages filled with James's sketches, each one depicting a moment or place in Clearhaven, the harbor at sunrise, children playing in the park, a snowy night with the café glowing in the distance. On the first page was a dedication written in James's elegant script. To Martha. For showing us all the power of kindness. You lit a spark that will never fade. Her vision blurred with tears as she looked up at the group surrounding her. It's beautiful, she said, her voice breaking. I don't deserve this. Yes, you do, James said firmly. This town wouldn't be the same without you. And neither would I. The room erupted into applause, the warmth of the moment wrapping around them like a blanket. Martha clutched the book to her chest, her heart fuller than it had ever been. As the night wore on and the café began to empty, Martha stood by the door, watching as her friends and neighbors disappeared into the cool night. She glanced back at the room, now quiet but still glowing with the echoes of laughter and conversation. James lingered near the counter, gathering his things. He paused, catching Martha's eye. You've created something special here, he said softly. Martha smiled, the weight of her gratitude settling into a quiet, peaceful joy. We all did, she replied. And as she locked the door behind him and stepped out into the crisp night air, she felt the unshakable sense that Clearhaven wasn't just a town. It was a testament to what could happen when people came together, each act of kindness sparking another, until the whole world seemed just a little brighter. This time, as Martha looked up at the stars, she felt something she hadn't in years, the certainty that no matter what challenges lay ahead, there would always be light. And that, she thought, was the greatest gift of all.